Good evening. This is The Digital Age, and I'm Jim Zirin. Tonight's show is about a new kind of war in cyberspace. When in late 2009, Chinese hackers penetrated Google's digital infrastructure, Google threatened to withdraw from China entirely. Later, the company softened its stance and said it might stay. Secretary of State Clinton said that there should be a full investigation of the matter and expressed grave concerns. Meanwhile, the Chinese government denied any involvement but refrained from further comment. Which brings us to our question tonight: are we ready for a cyber war? And here to help us answer this question is Adam Segal. Adam Segal is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, highly respected expert on technology and development in China and China's domestic and foreign policy. And he's the Ira A. Lipman Senior Fellow for Counterterrorism and National Security at the Council. How would you define cyber war?
Well, I think we talk about a lot of things when we talk about cyber war. I think there's attacks on another country's infrastructure. We talk about attacks on websites, website defacement. We can talk about cyber espionage, which would be stealing intellectual property rights or corporate secrets. We can also talk about attacks on individuals, political individuals, human rights activists.
Is that something distinct from amateur hackers or viruses?
In some places, they kind of converge. For most of us, yes, we're just worried about identity theft and someone stealing our credit card and using it. But in places like Russia and in China, some of the same people that are behind those schemes that are stealing credit cards are also sometimes used by the state for political reasons. We saw this in the case of attacks on Estonia and Georgia during the war, that some of the people behind the attacks had connections to the Chinese mafia, the Russian mafia, and they were organizing them, and then so there was a kind of a criminal element to this kind of state activity.
So cyber criminals may also be agents of the state for certain purposes.
Yes, the Chinese and the Russians in particular are happy to kind of have this at arm's length agreement or relationship with these criminal hackers to pursue some political means.
And then holy alliance.
Yes.
Now, National Intelligence Denny Blair said the attacks on Google were a wake-up call.
It's a wake-up call that's been long coming. I mean, you can see over the last 10 years, people have been warning that we are vulnerable to an attack on cyber infrastructure, in particular energy grids, power generation, and that either terrorist or a state actor could severely damage the United States there. I think what was new about Google was that the threat increasingly seems to be focused on economic secrets.
Obama's cyberspace policy review stated cybersecurity risks pose some of the most serious economic and national security challenges of the 21st century. A growing array of state and non-state actors are compromising, stealing, changing, or destroying information and could cause critical disruptions to the U.S. systems.
As manufacturing moves out of the United States, U.S. companies are increasingly reliant on intellectual property rights, content, digital matter. And so a threat to those things becomes a threat to the U.S. economic security, which then feeds into national security.
What would you consider the most sensitive cyber targets?
From the Google attacks, right, the attack seemed to be focused on Google and then 30 other high technology companies. We know in the past that the defense contractors have been targeted and penetrated massively, with terabytes of data on the F-35 and other defense systems were taken out of those things. So I think anything that's kind of a high technology, cutting edge design area seems to be extremely vulnerable and susceptible to attack.
And this might include our financial infrastructure or?
I think for an attack, yes, clearly an attack on the banking system, for someone who wanted to cause panic or shut down the U.S. economy, would also be a major target.
According to a recent Northrop Grumman report, China's investing substantial amounts of money in cyber warfare techniques. If you credit this, would it also be reasonable to suppose that the United States is also investing?
Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the Chinese and then the Russians and all the attacks, but what the U.S. does in cyberspace is a big black box. We have.
What do you mean by big black box?
Well, we don't know how much we spend on cyber weapons, cyber development, those areas. That's hidden in the U.S. defense budgets, and who engages in those attacks. It's not clear. Is it the U.S. military? Is it the Air Force for a while seemed to be taking a lead on cyber issues? What about the NSA? Right. So that's where most of the government capabilities exist in the NSA. They are probably taking the lead in
National Security Agency
in penetrating, exploiting, surveilling other countries' internet infrastructure, but they, of course, don't speak about what they're doing. So under this policy review that you mentioned that the Obama administration is undergoing, one of the things that we have done is set up a cyber command, a U.S. cyber command.
In the Pentagon?
In the Pentagon. It looks like it's going to be Keith Alexander, who's a 3-star.
An Army officer.
Well, he has from the NSA.
Yes.
So it's going to be located at Fort Meade, which is where the NSA is. So there's questions about how much kind of flow back and forth there's going to be.
Now, we also have a newly appointed Cyber-czar in the White House,
Right.
Howard Schmidt.
Right.
Now, he's got to deal with all these agencies that might be involved, the FBI or the CIA or the Homeland Security Agency. They all supposedly are engaged in turf wars. They all supposedly hate each other.
Right.
How can he possibly get any kind of coordination?
It's too early to tell how successful he's going to be. The response to his appointment seems to have been generally positive. People feel like he has the right set of skills, both military, business, and technological, that he can kind of pull these people together.
Well, his background was with a security company, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah. And then, so there's a sense that he might be able to get everyone on the page. But I think it's a big, big question about if he's going to be able to manage to coordinate these things. And as you said, for a while, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, was jockeying for position with the NSA, and we don't know how that's going to resolve itself.
Was there anything new about the way the attacks on Google and the other companies were carried out?
We still don't know exactly for sure. They exploited a weakness in Microsoft and Internet Explorer. There seems to have been some social engineering involved in that. Emails were sent to people who worked at Google that seemed to come from people that knew them that said, oh, by the way, good to see you last week, or, here's a memo I thought you'd be interested in, please open it. And so they opened it, and that provided some access. There has been some discussion about whether there was somebody working internally inside of Google who might have been involved. That would be new. But the attack itself seems to have been not, that Google describes it as incredibly sophisticated, but given all the other attacks we've had, it seems to be kind of in the same range.
Oh, Denny Blair also thought it was incredibly sophisticated.
A number of the technical experts that I've spoken to and read seem to say that it actually was not that sophisticated an attack.
So the degree of sophistication of the attack wouldn't necessarily suggest that the Chinese government was behind it, even if the attacks emanated from China.
No, I don't think you can necessarily correlate sophistication with who's behind them. And I think the sophistication probably came from the social engineering side, right? The kind of the realm of knowledge and information, the context that the people had to send these emails to people to trick them into clicking onto the links, as opposed to the technical vulnerability that they exploited. I think the reason that it seems is that the Chinese government has some connection to these attacks were the targets, right? Both not only the technology companies and what they were going after, but also the reading of the email of human rights activists and dissidents.
So no hole in Google software. It really was just the gullibility of people using Google from all.
Well, it seems to have been actually Microsoft. So there they were
yes.
using Internet Explorer that
yes.
they seem to have exploited that vulnerability.
Is there some reason why they don't seem to use Mac and Apple, but they use Microsoft and Internet Explorer.
There were numerous security issues with Microsoft, but also there's just much, 90% of the world's computers are Microsoft, and so if you're writing code, if you're writing Trojans or viruses, it just economies of scale make more sense to do it for PC than it does for Mac.
Well, you better educate us as to what a Trojan is.
Viruses that can be inserted into your computer that will then either collect information and then send it out to the person who controls the computer or controls the virus. There's a whole range now of things we call malware or spyware. These things all do things like they can collect your passwords for any website you go to. They can give control over, basically the workings of the computer so somebody can read anything that's on there and then send it back out.
Here's a Valentine from a friend of yours, and you click on it, and
right.
Pretty soon the whole computer is open.
Yeah, I mean, the one that probably most of us remember is the I love you virus. So you get this virus, oh, I love you, and you clicked on it, and you were then infected.
There is a certain relationship between these attacks and censorship in China, isn't there?
Well, the system that the Chinese have built, which is to control the flow of information on their side, right? So to prevent discussions about Tiananmen or Falun Gong or the Dalai Lama or whatever it might be, is then...
You mean among the Chinese people?
Among the Chinese people, is tied to their efforts to kind of, either hack into or attack other people as well. So yes, it's a kind of, there's two sides of the same coin for the Chinese. And also, as Secretary Clinton mentioned in her speech, it shows a kind of two different views of the internet. One controlled and used for attacks, which is how she described the Chinese internet, although she didn't name it by name. And then one open, transparent, free flow of information, which is she described as our view of the internet.
Let's listen to what she said.
On their own, new technologies do not take sides in the struggle for freedom and progress, but the United States does. We stand for a single internet where all of humanity has equal access to knowledge and ideas.
There was a reaction from the Chinese government to this speech. They said that the U.S. is seeking hegemonic domination in cyberspace. Now, in light of China's stance and this jousting back and forth, as a practical matter, is it really possible to have a single global internet?
I don't think so. I think that's clearly the goal, but I think it's inevitable, and we're already pretty far down that road of having separate kind of regional intranets that then kind of touch each other and contact each other. And the Chinese are going to be a big center for that. We have, what the China watching community calls the Great Firewall, which is, not only technologies that filter and surveil people, but also a human system. So people who monitor blogs, put in comments that are supportive of the government, self-censorship, right? Bloggers in China have to have a very sensitive kind of radar about what they can or can't say, and so of course they're probably going to hold themselves back. So you have that, or kind of this great firewall that separates the Chinese internet. You have language issues, right? So probably most Americans have not spent much time on Chinese websites. And then you have a system that now is beginning to allow Chinese language domain names, Cyrillic language domain names. So you're going to have that pushing in, and then you're going to have different technologies involved. So all of these things, I think, are going to push the Chinese internet to be different from this open access that the Secretary is talking about. And other countries like Iran and other one-country states are going to try to recreate it.
Is it really, or should it really be a national security priority for the United States if one Chinese citizen can't communicate with another Chinese citizen via Gmail on the subject of Tiananmen or some other issue of interest to dissidents?
I mean, I think the Secretary tried to walk a very delicate line, which is that on one hand, we have traditionally believed that the free flow of information, that greater political engagement will eventually be in the U.S. interest, and in particular with China, right? We have made this long-term bet with China's growth that as China develops, as China becomes more engaged with international organizations in the West, that it will become more liberal, more like us, more democratic. That bet we're still waiting to see if it's going to pay off. There's been lots of, in the last 6 weeks, 2 months, suggestions that the Chinese really aren't very enthusiastic about changing their system of government or necessarily following U.S. lead in the international system. So the other issue in particular with China is that the web is incredibly nationalistic. Many of the people that are involved in blogging and internet stuff have very negative views of the United States. So to allow them free access and more information and the ability to say whatever they want without censorship could be a bad thing for the United States.
Might be counterproductive.
It could be incredibly counterproductive, which is an issue across the web, right? We want protesters in Iran to have their anonymity, to be able to access information, to be able to communicate with their friends in other parts of Iran, but we don't want the same thing for Al-Qaeda. So how do you arrange for both of them is not a question we've answered yet.
But what has been our policy toward Al-Qaeda type websites or jihadi websites? We don't really want to take them down, do we? Because we want to spy on them and see what they're saying. Yeah,
there's been a debate, especially after the Christmas bombing, but also the teenagers who went to Pakistan. Right, they seem to have gained most of their information, to have met their contacts on the web. So there was a short debate about, well, we should just be knocking out jihadi websites when we see them. I think that's probably counterproductive and impossible, right? Any website we take off is going to just show up soon somewhere else, and counterproductive in the sense that we are probably gathering information, useful information from the websites, getting a sense of the debates and arguments that they're making. If they go off the web, then they move to face-to-face communication, notes, all these other kind of things, which requires human intelligence. Which is much harder for us to do, quite honestly.
In terms of the remedy for the Google flap, Secretary Clinton called for a full and thorough investigation, called on the Chinese. Yeah. Do you think that's ever going to happen?
No. I mean, the Chinese have, clearly stated that they weren't behind it, which is the traditional kind of response. And they're going to continue saying we're not involved, and not only that, but the other part of the Chinese campaign so far has been, well, we're also hacked all the time, right?
We're a victim.
We're a victim, and not only that, we've traced back many of the attacks, and they come from U.S. computers. So they've been using that.
So it's almost a he said, she said. The Washington Post says it was the Chinese government. The Chinese government says it was the U.S.
Well, the U.S. government or U.S. users, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be very little chance the Chinese are going to be, on the Google front. I have more hope that we might be able to engage the Chinese in a broader discussion, which is that, if we talk about cyber war, right, there's cyber conflict, which would be, if the U.S. military were to attack parts of the Chinese military, take out their networks, try to make sure that the Navy can't communicate with headquarters, those kind of things. Do we have any idea what escalation would look like, right? Do we know, well, if you take out the base and you take out the generators, can you just take out the generators? Would that affect, local communities? Those kind of questions. And I'm hopeful that we can.
You have issues of collateral damage. You have
collateral
issues
damage,
of active war.
Exactly. What would actually be a kind of, would we consider this taking out a generator an act of war, or is it vandalism? Those kind of issues. And I think we should begin to try to engage the Chinese on those discussions. Those are probably likely to be track 2, non-official, kind of behind closed doors. But I think that would be useful.
Well, Secretary Clinton also said those who disrupt the free flow of information in our society pose a threat to our economy, our government, and our civil society. I mean, there's almost a suggestion there that there's a threat that we're going to respond to it in some way.
I think there's the rhetorical device about claiming this open web, this discussion about, she did talk about international cooperation, but we don't know what the specifics are. The most concrete specific is, what are we going to do to help protesters in repressive or authoritarian states? And here there is money in the State Department budget for paying for things like proxy servers, which will help you get past the censors and the filters, things that can anonymize your identity, and that money probably will be spent.
But hasn't yet.
Hasn't yet in the past, because one of the groups that is best at doing these things is connected to the Falun Gong, the religious organization, which the Chinese consider a terrorist organization. And given that the Obama administration, at least in its first year, very much wanted to work with the Chinese on a whole range of issues. It didn't want to be seen to be in bed with Falun Gong.
Now here's a real question about threat. Do you see any danger that the Chinese interests would be able to share their hacking techniques with terrorist organizations, with Al-Qaeda, who would not be so reluctant to take down the U.S. electrical grid if they could?
I wouldn't expect the Chinese to be, so far the Chinese have not been interested in jihadi terrorists, right? Given their concern about the Uyghurs and Xinjiang, they're unlikely to get into bed with them. I think,
so they have Muslim groups in China.
Muslim groups in China that they're worried about instability and insurgency in those areas. I think, the Russian mafia, that's a different story. But I think also, look, most of this stuff, it's not that hard to develop, right? A lot of it you can download yourself. You or I could download some of these cyber weapons, cyber viruses. And so to find a hacker to do it is not very difficult.
There is an issue, is there not, about underreporting? Companies are attacked, and unlike Google, which came forward and made quite a fuss about the attacks, and even the other 30 companies, we're not sure which ones they are. There's been some speculation in the press. But because companies are afraid of their reputation, with consumers or whatever, they don't want to come forward and say they've been attacked by the Chinese. Isn't that right?
That's right. So we keep on referring to Google and these 30 other companies, but what those companies are, we're not exactly sure. And the ones that Google named, then they denied it, right? They said that wasn't us. Yes, there's a kind of a reputational issue involved. There's some legal issues, right? If you open yourself and say, yes, we're vulnerable and we didn't take care of these issues. And that's one of the things that that we're hoping the cyber coordinator will be able to kind of bring these groups together. So how do you deal with these legal issues? How do you deal with sharing of information, right? Because some of the code may be proprietary, or you're releasing some information that's proprietary. So one of the things we're hoping will happen, because for anything to work, for any defense to be successful, there has to be this public-private cooperation, right? All the infrastructure is privately owned, right? And so that really needs to start happening. How do we talk about these issues? And we do need these companies to come forward and say, yeah, we have this problem, we need to work on it.
Well, there's an issue called equities, isn't there? So that if we know there's a hole in the Microsoft software which makes the user vulnerable to attack, and we patch the hole, the Chinese or the Russians are using the same software.
Right.
So if we wanted to attack them, after we plug the hole, it would make it much more difficult to do so. Isn't that right?
Yeah, so everyone is involved in this kind of cat and mouse chase about, well, what have you plugged and what have I plugged, and what vulnerabilities do I know about? And so a lot of the vulnerabilities now that people are talking about are 0 day, right? So they just show up. No one has known about them before. And those are things you want to hold on to, right? If you're going to use them in an attack. And so the issue is, well, how do you protect without letting your vulnerabilities be known, but also know what you are going to exploit for somebody else?
So cyber warfare, as you describe it, is a real whodunit, almost a whodunit thriller, because you don't know where the next attack is going to come from. You don't know who's going to be responsible for the attack. You may know eventually what the target is. You don't know whom to retaliate against. I mean, in Cold War terms, how do you retaliate, or how do you launch a deterrent? Right. I mean, all we can do is kind of hunker down and try to protect our vital infrastructure.
I think, yeah, that's exactly right. So one of the most interesting things about the cyber framework is that, it's not space, and it's not air, and it's not water, which all have, physical qualities to them that we understand, because we understand physics and gravity and all these other things. So as you said, the cyber domain is constantly being changed as software is being rewritten and written. And so, as you said, we have all these problems. We have attribution. We don't know necessarily who did the attack. We don't know necessarily what they're after. Are they just, is it somebody who, a kid who's just showing off and seeing which kind of systems he can access? Or is it a military hacker who's going into the system so he can leave things behind and come back later and trigger them?
And then if you put more security on the net, there are First Amendment and civil liberties issues. Do you want an internet where the There's cyber police everywhere.
Exactly. So one of the other things is not only do Americans think that the internet should be, free flow of information, but we also think it should be highly anonymous, right? One of the things, that to use the old New Yorker joke, right? On the internet, no one knows if you're a dog, and we see that as a central kind of right on the internet. So, but much of the security would come from knowing who you exactly are, who you say you are on the internet. So that's going to be a major issue. I think probably the Cold War perimeter defense is just probably not the way to think about it. There's just too much change. There's no way to build that kind of perimeter. I think the more likely metaphor, and the one that other people have talked about, is a kind of disease or public health metaphor, which is that kind of a lower down, decentralized, constantly changing, constantly adapting and maneuvering, quarantining things, and then moving on.
Role for the UN and perhaps brokering some kind of international convention regulating cyber warfare?
The UN has suggested it. The problem is it's hard for me to imagine what arms control would look like, because as we said, if I can download the weapon and you can download the weapon, things that look like defensive mechanisms, like just being able to scan a network, well, that also has offensive capability. So, be very
Adam,
hard
this has been absolutely fascinating. We have to wrap up. So I have a question for you. How ready are we for a cyber war?
Not ready at all.
You think we're not ready at all? Well, Adam Segal, thank you for coming by. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. For the digital age, I'm Jim Zirin. Good night and all the best.